of Kittens and Broken Things. Chapter 58.
Garrus pondered the concept of predictably unpredictable and whether or not that in fact added up to predictable. Regardless of the hallmarks of his bondmate's decisions, she was his bondmate. She made decisions. He abided by them. Mostly. He was the one that had lurched from predictable to unpredictable in his public announcement. Or was that in fact predictable because he had told her he would? Was predictability an ideal? Was unpredictability? It definitely kept him on Talon tips. He had his bondmate, he had his clan. He was still counselor, and that was almost disappointing in an odd way. Even Turians had turned unpredictable, allowing a human bondmate. It was, of course, more complicated than that. This was definitely not a precedent, but an exception, a peculiar event, and Russ's induction the same. Still things that were wrong, but as though the Vicarian clan had paid enough in tribute to mask the scent of the blue squeezed from Turian ancestors who were affronted from their supposedly wise and lofty station of judgment. Garrus had enough pushback that he wanted to puncture smirks and slights physically. His mother's example and Kara's relative cluelessness, which he absolutely wanted to preserve as whole, kept the smile on his face and the adoration in his eyes. Occasionally he felt the warmth leach out of him and icy rage settle in its place, and he looked away until he could meet her eyes again with something less homicidal. As a good Turian should, he kept his eyes upon his Ava. Kara was clueless only about the things that she could, or would, do nothing about. Her scent gave away what her eyes or words did not. She was not going to attempt to change Turian minds. He was less hopeful that Turian minds would change than the new Turians would be born who learned new things and made new choices. He imagined she focused on new Turians being born in a long-term sense. The state of war added to the sense of exception and not precedent. Turians understood war. He mentally cringed slightly at the fact that they'd been uplifted for the purpose and did not feel as proud of it as he always had otherwise. They were exceptional as fighters. That made them valuable, and had made them excellent pawns of the Solarians for centuries. In a real sense, he'd made an excellent pawn for Kara. He was so Turian that the sentiment expressed there made him feel better and not worse. At least he'd chosen well. He had done a lot at the Citadel, but being on Palaven, even protected by the Madless, made him realize how much Palaveni politics and attitudes were not dictated by the Citadel and resurgently pushed back against any external reform. There was little welcome here for him except within the Vicarian Madless. Everything he'd done could be wiped out, if not by Reapers, then by someone else taking his job. Someone more plate-rigid and proud of being uplifted in all the wrong ways. He decided predictability was a bad thing in a lot of ways he hadn't considered previously. Turian insularity was predictable. Reapers were predictable, eventually. He might be replaced by someone who would ride that rebound, someone who could proudly state in their veiled Turian pride code that their marks had not been tainted or divided, their lineage true and their clan undefiled by the lack of tradition that had been an obvious sign of hubris and desperation. Their loyalties would be unquestioned, as Turians were gloriously lost to the predictable 50,000-year cycle of extinction that had produced no new results. He wanted, desperately wanted, to no longer be counselor, to leave that part of him behind, to follow his Ava only, a verse with no plate and thin hide. She was predictable in her results, except during catastrophic failure and death. Perhaps he had miscalculated, making his announcement too early. Maybe full-blown Reaper invasion had really been the only cover under which his bond would have not been the headline. He had his own resurgent pushback against that emotionally. Regardless of the stress of so many things, wanting to kill them and keep them apart, he wasn't going to regret what he'd done. Only reflect. Did she regret it? He smiled. No, she did not. Fortunately there he had no doubts. She created no doubts. Moments away from her were darker, enough to make him question what moved in the shadows. When she was back, she'd light whatever space they held together. Sometimes that was worse, because sometimes there were things moving in the shadows that the bright light revealed, but he preferred the straightforward. He found it difficult to represent a race that would not accept his bondmate, had alienated and nearly killed Russ, and only valued either of those people as exceptions that would prove a rule. Only the powerful could afford to keep pets of such ostentatious social cost. Madless Walls listened, and he imagined that the most whispered adage from non-Vicarian mouths was, "Heavy feet leave tracks, but not for long." As though the Vicarians were some self-satisfied and overgrown herbivore, something to be brought down easily by a coordinated clan. But if he didn't represent these dark-sliced people, some other Turian would do it. And that other Turian would be predictably predictable. All precedents followed, all diversity stamped out as corruption. Then Turians gone, a whispered myth like Protheans, luck spires and Kirisat shapes pondered over by future peoples who looked different but faced the same fate and worried about internal power struggle until power was taken from them. There was something remotely cold and arterial spray hot about Kara. He occasionally wondered what it was that caused her to watch her colony on Mindoir get rounded up, raped and slaughtered, burned alive. How a 16-year-old girl could have sat still through it. What that did to the inside of someone's head or heart. He had to admit it. He found that inexcusably cold, un-Turian, and even inhuman when he took those circumstances out of her context. All the talk of Sonar's about Pan Ifa, her smile as she assured Garrus she'd slaughter him at the game, as much as he'd slaughter her in hand-to-hand. The potential for cold in that smile. The point wasn't really that she'd endured all that pain. It was that she'd contained it, controlled it, made that call. Felt like hell about it later, but contained that as well. His instinct was that a person was blasted open by that level of trauma. Was there really nothing in her that would blast her open, make her angry, make her care in the ways that other people cared, ways that were much more easily comprehended? He loved her, but spirits, was she wrong, or unfathomable in so many ways? He could imagine the sort of thing he'd been taught about humans, the war barely over, her the illuminated example of human behavior. Her story spun in a Turian direction, familiar and chilling on its own, familiar in tone and in the faces of young Turians eager to learn the way. A dissection of a human, metaphorically pinned to a display board, gutted and analyzed. Here you see a human girl. Note the small size, the coloring. On Earth, evolution has taken a path such that poisonous creatures are brightly colored as a warning to predators. Slavers killed her parents. She didn't fight. She didn't protest. She hid. She didn't try to save anyone. She disavowed her own name. She is a dead thing. Humans believe that they have what they call souls, and that those souls live on after they've died. If that's true, and this is from their own lips, this girl, by their own myths about themselves, is a ghost. No loyalty, no name, no clan. They're all like this. They have nothing to live for, loyal only to their selfish urges. To set free their ghost is to take them from the misery they live in, sundered from all the things we know matter. They fight like wild things, but they have no honor, no courage. They all want to die. They say of Turians that you'll never see our backs until we're dead. This pathetic child is proof that you'll never see a human's face, only a ghost's back. Pity her, but do not be fooled. She is poisonous. It's not her fault. She is a child. She had no clan to guide her. When you see a poisonous wild thing, you kill it so they do not breed and bite. You kill it so your clan stays safe from their mindless advance. They have to have stories about souls because they have no spirits. Their bodies are prisons, their lives miserable and selfish. Take a good look. It is a mercy to set them free. He could see it, feel it from other Turians. She was a ghost with no face. He couldn't even deny it to himself. Her face was manufactured. He was grateful for her manufactured face. She understood the need for it. Now he understood even more the need for it. She'd had no clan, no ancestors, nobody, and she'd had the strength to survive it. If she saw herself tacked to a display board in effigy, her hair pointed out as a sign of her internal sickness, she'd feel sorry for the ignorant Turians teaching easy hate and simplistic philosophy, all geared toward what Turians like to do, kill something righteously. She'd contain it, she'd understand it, and ask him to do the same. That's what she was doing. He contained it. He didn't rise to the level of understanding. He wondered if it was her nature to forgive and find a way to understand as blindly as Turians found a way to categorize and kill. At least she didn't forgive Reapers. Maybe that's because she didn't understand them. Spirits help us if she ever understands them. Turns out he's a good Turian. It would feel clean to get back to killing things righteously. But if Kara was willing to forge greater good by denying parts of her nature and loosing others, he would do the same. This woman had died, literally and figuratively, many times, become a ghost of herself, and had fought her way back to herself without clan, without support, without anybody on her side because she never exposed her flank, except to him. In spirits he loved her so much, the cold and the hot of her, the remote and the intimate, and all the things about her he did not understand. She wasn't a pawn. He could believe she was a ghost, a spirit, one of the Turian myths of something generated that embodied something, a creature blessed with the ability to leave and return to her body at the will of the people. Okay, so those people were speciesist and they spent a lot of money getting it done, but it sounded fitting the other way. He was at the moment tapping his stylus, the paperwork of being counselor making C-Sec paperwork look like a dream job. C-Sec paperwork had been describing petty events from his point of view. This was galactic information poured into him. C-Sec had been frustrating, and although he could exert the power of the council office, mostly he experienced helplessness on what felt like an infinite scale, fed on a stream of reports that he knew were lacking the real information required, polls and noise that were overamped distractions. He ran the risk of moments of inattention, meaning he would miss a true threat because he was so accustomed to distractions. Thankfully, blessedly, he heard Kara enter the rooms, tossed the datapad and stylus aside, and leaned back in his chair with a relaxation of the tension in his shoulders and jaw he hadn't been aware of until it was gone. Fast footsteps, running, and they weren't heavy, just enthusiastic. No clan would find her footprints. He was certain of it. She rounded the corner and launched herself at him once she saw him, moving faster, arms around his cowl and his hands around her waist, pulling her into his lap. He should be terribly curious about what just happened, but he really didn't care. Didn't want to hear about Sonar or Yesed or any of the stresses that threatened to pull her apart. He just wanted to lessen those stresses. He didn't speak. She was squeezing tight. He resisted the urge to attempt to dissect her to understand and categorize. Whether it was from his own people's whispers and smirks, a weapon in the dark, an insult in the air, or coveting, from whatever source he just wanted to protect her from it, them, and make it about being safe. There was plenty of time to be unsafe later. He closed his eyes, arm around her waist and his arm supporting her back, a hand in her hair. He breathed her in. She still smelled of metal, but it was fading. She'd been in her fight, and he wanted to help her forget it. They'd survived. They were together, and that's all he cared about. The world narrowed down in focus to what mattered, what he valued, what he should not take for granted.
Dance with me.
She'd never asked him to dance. Do you even like dancing?
The way you do it. Yes.
The way he did it was to pick her off the floor and never let her feet touch down. That's the way he liked it too. He said, "With you hanging on like a wet verse trying to climb a tree to get away from a flood?"
Yes, exactly like that.
So you already live somewhere that has a tree.
You are the best tree.
He kissed her hair, stood without dislodging her. She helped. She was an expert clinger. Her arms around his cowl, her legs around his waist, the warm curve of her thighs, a seemingly utilitarian necessity of the clinging, except for her tensed and relaxed muscles that made clinging an activity and not passivity. Out of that rhythm, he bent his mouth to her ear and hummed. Turians didn't sing, and neither did she, but he hummed, with her head down on chest plate, one of her hands moving to spread her delicate fingers along the vibrating span of vocal and sub-vocal expression. There was a lazy gyroscopic spin to the rhythm of her thighs, the hum of his throat, the movement of his legs across the open space of the floor, and the sway of his upper body holding her, controlled dips and turns. If the spirits could not appreciate this clinging, poisonous, and glorious creature that did not need to stand in imperious demand in order to be obeyed, screw the spirits. Yeah, you heard me. Screw you guys if you don't love her like I do. If you knew how this felt, how she feels, you would understand why I'm not even a little bit sorry for what I've done, how I've stolen her and kept her, how she wants me to, lets me. If you could smell, feel, taste her complications and simplicity. He stopped thinking, and his surge of self-satisfied defiance blended into rougher humming, interrupted by deeper breathing, a tightening of her thighs that couldn't keep their rhythm because his clinging verse was spun into weakness, the warmer shift of her scent into desire that bloomed on her around him like sunlight. The perfect kind of predictable, where her fight faded away and he held the woman with her and his ambitions cast aside as too heavy and too hot. The horrifically cold image of her dissected and presented in the worst light echoed in his mind as he shook it off as shadow and darkness, none of which had any power over him now. Now the only theme of that image changed to what he knew he could have, what he knew he could do. Here you see a human girl. Here I hold a human woman. Note the small size, the coloring. Thank the spirits for those blessings. Her thighs had lost any rhythm. His throat had lost its vibrating dedication to dance, and now her scent, his body turned to her with reverie sharpness, and possessive ownership made those things blessings. On Earth, evolution has taken a path such that poisonous creatures are brightly colored as a warning to predators. And sometimes the coloring means she's beautiful, deadly and beautiful. Slavers killed her parents. She didn't fight. She didn't protest. She hid. She didn't try to save anyone. She disavowed her own name. She fought for her own life. She won. She fights for other people's lives with the same dedication, practice, and determination. She forged her own name. She is a dead thing. She was a dead thing. Now she's alive, and she's mine. Humans believe that they have what they call souls, and that those souls live on after they've died. If that's true, and this is from their own lips, this girl, by their own myths about themselves, is a ghost. No loyalty, no name, no clan. She doesn't believe she has a soul. She was a ghost. She is loyal to me. She has our name. She has our clan. He lost interest in the rest of accusation and cold Turian description, fixated on the word hour, as his hum faded to silence, then a groan against her lips, her sigh and tightening of her arms and legs around him. He didn't have to care if Tuolan gave her these clothes any more. He'd replace them, as long as he got to shred them off her, which he did, and she, bless her, did not give a damn any more than he did. The shy woman she'd been around him no longer existed. He could bring her out with words and teasing if he wanted, make her rise to the surface to snap at bait if he asked her if she wanted sex on his desk. She'd sputter and fuss, and that was expected. But it was now an inside joke, a running and now increasingly ironic persona that only appeared with words. Reverie otherwise took her whole, and both of them had lost interest in novelty of location, shredded like her clothes. Her hands were frantic, pressed warmth, finding the fastenings of his clothing blind, her mouth against his, her thighs twisting and hips lifting, his arms and hands shifting on her body to support her. Sometimes she moved slowly and lingered. Sometimes she was ravenous and greedy, and whatever pace she set, he'd take the other path somewhere in the long hours of reverie. With the strain and pace and frantic movement, she was headed for what she called sudden death, and that was entirely welcome. So acutely hungry that her tiny nails would scratch at him and she would engulf him in one stroke, an ecstatic force of all in as the express state of her nature in her encompassing way. Her hand glided along his cock in one slow, slick, welcoming reverie from his mouth, and now along her numbing palm, causing a slow, suspended groan from them both, until she knew he'd move her hips where she needed them, knew he'd surge for her, knew she'd claim him fully without reservation and with her gleeful solemnity. She had asked him, and he had told her. Slow, teasing thrusting was a beautiful thing where he could watch her bite her lip and tilt her head, and he would do that later. But being able to join suddenly and completely was something so Turian he doubted he could explain. She hadn't asked him to explain, understood things being inexplicable, but he still tried to find words when it happened. Maybe someday he could find eloquence, but she didn't try to find words either, small and ragged and pale things against the gift of full immersion, being always too much for her, and the too much she chased with her righteous greed. He imagined she dreamed of exactly what it meant to him, her time spent unconscious and overcome something not of neutral passivity, but like the tensing of her thighs and her hand on his throat, the reverse of anticipation, the height of repletion. He was inside her in the clutching, tensing, and near questioning and then satisfied keening of her throat that reached her lips, as he tasted it on her tongue, time dilated, and her ecstatic motions and clinging. Wherever she was, wherever she went, she loved him from there, always would. The soul she did not believe in would find her way back to her body after being overwhelmed, and he would be here when she woke to him. And he would find words and expressions of his own, find hers in the hours of reverie that was all the reason he needed to want to win any fight. He stayed with her, joined, murmurs and swaying, danced with her, danced for her, and knew she heard him and felt him in whatever dream of bliss carried her to where she whispered his name and sighed with her body clinging to him, her soul on a journey where they were together for every swaying dance step. She'd be back. He'd be there with her. When she returned, when her eyes opened and she smiled, and wherever she'd gone must have been heaven. Predictable or unpredictable didn't matter anymore. As long as she did both of those things with him, he couldn't see why he would care about the distinction.